Welcome back to The Standard. We're joined once again by writer Chris Bennett, who is asking for the right to grow and consume marijuana for religious reasons. So, I'm sure a lot of people watching, or certainly some people watching, are thinking this is a gimmick. This is a sort of, you're using religion as your excuse to basically smoke pot, which can be argued one way or another, but religion may not really be the heart of what you're doing. How do you respond to that?
I would say to those people, try Googling Jesus Cannabis and see how much information comes up on that. I have a 20-year history of using cannabis as a religious sacrament that's been well established. And I've written 3 big books on the history of cannabis as in religion and magic. And I probably know more about that particular history than anybody else. I have a very sincere belief that cannabis is the tree of life, that people like Moses and Jesus used cannabis, that cannabis has been used in India in honor of gods like Shiva and Kali, the goddess, that cannabis has played a major role in the Islamic religion among Sufis. And, in this cultural milieu which we live in the 21st century, I am part of all of those traditions and all of those cultural uses. And my own experience with cannabis, has shown me that it is the most beneficial and wonderful thing there is on earth. And no matter what religion you are, no matter what faith and doctrine you believe in, whatever Bible or holy book you believe in, that book has been written by the hands of man. But God created the plants of this earth. And no matter what God you believe in, you better believe that God created cannabis, and he put it here for a purpose. He or she put it here for a purpose.
We talked about Moses and his potential use of marijuana in your interpretation. But you just mentioned Jesus, so Are you suggesting Jesus also smoked pot?
What happens when you follow the history of these references to cannabis in the Old Testament is eventually the whole thing gets prohibited. There's this holy anointing oil and incenses that are used by the priest castes and the kings, and they're eventually prohibited as the Jewish kingdom grows into a big empire, and they're more so focused on things like laws and taxes and things like that, moving away from sort of shamanistic exploits. But the name Christ itself is a Greek translation of a Hebrew term, Messiah. And that term means the anointed ones. It makes direct reference to this anointing oil. And many of the so-called miracles in the New Testament are actually ailments which cannabis has been used to treat medically, even in our modern times. And when you take a look back at the history of the early Christian church and what was going on over the first few centuries, this anointing oil played a pivotal role, but it was forced into the background as the Roman Catholic Church came into power and water baptism took great over it. But texts from the time period say there is fire in the anointing oil. And through the anointing oil, we're initiated into unfading bliss. Well, there was only water in the baptism. So they make it quite specific that there was a certain power in this anointing oil. And they apply it to numbers of ailments like crooked limbs and skin diseases and stuff like that. And so it's very specific that it has healing qualities, and they even refer to it as the plant of kindness being in the holy oil. So it's very, very specific, and in the inception of the Dark Ages, a large part of that has to do with the suppression of pagan religions and other religions, as well as scores of other Christian groups known collectively under the name Gnosticism, which had a very different view of Christianity than that what has come down to us through the New Testament, which was put together around 350 AD, roughly, out of numbers of books. It was edited down. Luckily, in our own time, we've rediscovered many Christian texts via the Gnostic Library, discovered in Nag Hammadi, as well as the influence of the earlier Dead Sea Scrolls, which predate Christianity. And taking a look at these texts here, we can really show that there was a huge role for these cannabis-based anointing oils and incenses in the early Christian period. And people can find out about this by simply Googling Jesus Cannabis.
Well, let's take for the sake of argument that you're right, that there is this connection between cannabis and the Bible. I think a lot of people would still argue, not necessarily focused on your case, but using the Bible as a reference for laws is a dangerous, slippery slope.
Have you ever read the Canadian, it's all based in God.
Right.
And people swear on the Bible.
Right.
So it's all clearly instituted.
But then when you get to issues like gay marriage, or issues like abortion.
Which I'm supportive of gay marriage and issues like abortion. I'm not, as I said, I recognize cannabis as used by Moses, as used by Jesus in the Bible, but I also recognize it in the Vedas. I recognize it in other religious texts and religious traditions and stuff like that. So I don't want to give you the impression that my view is like some sort of orthodox biblical view. My belief is that cannabis is the tree of life. That's what the basis, the fundamental belief in the Church of the Universe is that cannabis is the tree of life. Members of the Church of the Universe are obligated to promote the use of cannabis as the tree of life, whether that be through, selling hemp clothes and hemp food and providing hemp medicines and stuff like that. And that's the central pillar of our religion. Maybe in some Christian churches, it might be the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. That's the central pillar of their religion. In our religion, it's that cannabis is the tree of life. And as it's for the healing of the nations, all of the world's traditions that have evolved around cannabis are part of that tree of life.
Well, tell me about the book that you've most recently written.
Yeah, I've just been finished up a book called Cannabis and the Soma Solution, which is coming out in February with an American publishing company, Trying Day. Basically, that book follows the history of cannabis in ancient Indo-European culture. Indo-Europeans are the ancestors, the Indo-European language is the ancestors of French, English, German, even Sanskrit in India, Persian language. All these different languages come from the Indo-European language. And the oldest evidence we have of people using cannabis for intoxicating purposes actually originates in the Ukraine region. And it's like 3500 BC, people were burning cannabis in incense censers in the Ukraine region and inhaling the fumes for shamanic purposes. These same people were the first people to domesticate the horse and master horseback riding. And these people spread cannabis throughout the ancient world, affecting a number of traditions. They even went up into China. In the last few years, they've discovered a 2,700-year-old Caucasian mummy in China that was buried with 2 pounds of female cannabis. And this cannabis had been cultivated for its intoxicating purposes.
This is what year?
2,700 years ago, 700 BC. This same group here picked up the Chinese name for cannabis, Huma. In China, cannabis had been used by Taoist religions for some centuries prior to this as the plant of immortality. These same people took cannabis down into the Afghanistan region, where it was adopted by a culture known as the Mazdian culture, who later became known as Zoroastrians, and became the drink Hayoma. From the Chinese Huma, we get the Hayoma. These same people then traded into India, where the Hayoma became Soma. And this is a source of the Vedic religion, which inspired the Indian religion. And clearly the Soma was considered as the inspirational fount from which that religion grew. There's whole books dedicated to the intoxicating powers of the Soma and its use as an inspirational force for spirituality. And, this is identical to the same way that it's influenced musical movements, like the Rastafarian reggae movement has all been influenced by it, or the rock and roll movement of the 60s, you know what I mean? All these movements, the jazz movement of the 30s, all these inspirational and creative forces have been inspired by cannabis.
Oh, well, we just have a couple moments left, but what's next with your case?
November 3rd, we appear in court. We've given our affidavits of information that we're going to supply, as well as who our expert witnesses are going to be, Professor Carl Ruck, Professor of Classical Mythology, and Professor Scott Littleton, a Professor of Indo-European Studies. We will establish a long, strong history of cannabis, and I will connect myself to that historical stream.
Okay, well, thanks for sharing all this with us.
Thank you.
More of The Standard when we return.